This is Paul. Big news today. Finally, the Glen Scrivener, Alex O'Connor, hosted by Justin Brierley thing dropped for the rest of us. And it also happened to fall on a day when I had my past CRC cluster pastoral meeting at our furthest away church in our cluster. So I had time in the car there and back to listen to almost the whole thing. So I can't do a real deep dive. I don't know that it needs it. I think the talk did get bogged down, partly because, as is often the case, this argument that they sort of take on both Tom Holland's thesis of dominion and then Glen Scrivener's The Air We Breathe thesis, how much Western culture is attributable uniquely to Christianity. That's a very difficult thesis to sort of prove. And all of our language is sort of estimation, but there's some interesting things in this that I thought maybe we could poke around at. One of the early things that struck me was fairly early in the video, Alex sort of made an interesting move, which I didn't expect, to sort of contrast. At one point, in fact, he says that the culture of the Bible was particularly barbaric, which really kind of surprised me. The culture of the Bible tended to be, I don't know if that's a fair statement, that it was more barbaric than the Greeks or the Romans. Pederasty, even just looking at, let's say, marriage culture of the Old Testament. We're going to have to talk about slavery. Slavery dominated a lot of this talk, but basically marriage culture of the Hebrew society, save polytheism, that goes away, but you don't have marrying children. You don't have sleeping with children. I mean, you don't have that you don't have celebrations of same-sex sexuality, for example. So, and we're going to have to talk about human liberty, but that really surprised me, because I would have thought that it's not too tough to say that Athenian and, let's say, Spartan culture and Roman culture was more barbaric than Hebrew culture. Maybe that's a bias because I'm a Christian minister, but it's what I thought. So, we sort of went into Marcion.
The sin I think both sides, as it were, commit on this issue is, I think, an overemphasis, is to say that in the same way that you might say exposure in the ancient world, it does seem to be that we have records of Christians being the ones who are sort of anti this, who are sort of the antidote to exposure. And of course, happy to grant that. I just don't want to overstep the influence of Christianity in particular over the entire development of the Western tradition.
What he says right there, that's his main point. And that's a strong point to, it's not really a strong point. It's just like, I think Tom Holland and you, Glenn, oversell. And it's not a difficult thing to defend that. I can point out a lot of things. So we're going to look at a few things.
In the same way, I might want to talk about the way that the church has stood in the way of a number of important instances of progress towards the West today. And I don't mean moral progress in an objective sense. I just mean movement from where it was to where it is. But you then wouldn't want me to overstep and say, therefore, the church has been, the greatest roadblock, and Christianity is evil and terrible. So I just don't want to overstate the case. My biggest problem with Christianity as responsible for these developments is its attachment to Judaism. The extent that in the early church, Marcion famously thought...
And again, it's his biggest problem, and I thought, wow, that sort of surprised me.
That the God of the Old Testament could not be the same God of Jesus. He produces this text called the Antithesis, where he compares the sayings and doings of the Old Testament God and Jesus, and says these cannot be the same kind of person. And as long as you've got this attachment to this Jewish tradition, I find it very difficult to square how you have these kinds of condemnations that Christianity, allows people to have of Roman practices, without them similarly indicting the God that I'm told is the God that sort of came down into the figure of Jesus. They sort of have this excusability with the Jewish God. Now, you might say that the very means by which they're able to look at the Jewish God and say, these are things that trouble me and things I don't like, is essentially Christian. But if that's the case, then you're kind of left with a paradox as to what you're talking about when it comes to Christian values. If you want to agree with what I'm saying, which is that those are still present in the Old Testament, then you kind of become a bit of a Marcionite in saying that, well, the only thing that matters is Jesus. We can just kind of ignore the Old Testament, say that that was wrong and that doesn't matter. Or if you need to own it and not be a Marcionite, not be a heretic, then you need to offer an account for how that wasn't wrong when Yahweh was doing it. And how, it's okay for Jesus to enter into that world and not be seen as this sort of, fundamental negation of the Jewish religion. Whereas when he does it for the Romans, it's a negation as well. Also, it's quite easy to pick on specific examples. For example, why do the Romans invade Gaul? We have Julius Caesar's own words as to why he invaded Gaul. What are some of the reasons? Do we know? Well, one reason he gives is that the people there essentially are practicing human sacrifice. He includes this as one of the...
Okay, now my main point of critique with Alex O'Connor in this, and I think in some ways he won. I really do. Sorry, Glenn. I think Glenn is like my favorite Christian apologist debater. I've told Glenn before when I'd see him when I'd go to the UK, I think he's one of the cleverest guys on YouTube. I really love Glenn. But I think Alex sort of won this in many ways, if you want to sort of frame it that way. And partly because it's an easier, you basically have to keep, let's say, the Holland thesis, or Glenn does differentiate his thesis from Tom's. So the Scrivener fleet thesis or the Holland thesis, you basically have to defeat it and say, I don't think you made your case. And that's a far easier thing to defend than to make the case, especially because for many of us, our audiences are just sort of tipping one way or the other. But my main critique of Alex O'Connor is that I think the way he portrays how the Bible works, and I think the Bible works differently with Christians than the Torah, the Law and the Prophets work with Jews, and the Quran and some of their other sacred texts work with Muslims, and the Book of Mormon, and the Upanishads are different. Texts work different ways in different religions, partly because the texts themselves are different. The addition of the New Testament onto the Old Testament changes, obviously, for Christians, how the Old Testament is understood and read. There's a new interpretive framework that comes in there. I think O'Connor's point is good. Recently on, let's see if I can find it. For those of you not familiar with the TLC, this is a corner of that may or may not be the TLC, depending on who's sort of manning the ship over there. And Jacob's Corner, Jacob Federecci, a lot of Jews, and both religious Jews and ethnic Jews, debating things, but Marcion came up, and Yosef, who's a very learned man, bringing up some new developments in New Testament studies in Germany, which were really quite interesting.
Anything I say would just be kind of conspiracy theorist level.
I gotcha. I recommend looking into that a little. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I know you're.
I will. On the other hand, I will say, if I look at the comments for a second, I don't know Brent here, but yes, Brent. There's lots of really interesting things going on in scholarship on the original Paul, especially kind of in the German literature on reconstructing Paul from Marcion. Well, what version he maybe had the original for. And yeah, David Litwell's stuff's really cool. If you want to understand, especially Gnosticism, early Gnosticism, and who was Simon Magus and Valentinus, right? Like, great. I'll second those recommendations. I haven't found as much useful from Litwell necessarily on Jewish stuff. doesn't, he engages with,
That wasn't really what I'm looking for. But basically, he just touched on it briefly there. Basically, there's some German scholars that are sort of inverting the New Testament and saying, what if Marcion's New Testament was the original and Paul sort of forks it? And of course, there's always the argument that Paul forks Christianity in an alien way. And so Paul will come up quite a bit here. But O'Connor's point here is interesting that, well, you've got these tensions between, on one hand, we could bring Sam in and say, well, to what degree does Jesus claim to be, not just to, you get into Trinitarian language, to be the God of Israel, to be the coming of the, or is it, the Son of God and not a Trinitarian, also God? And I don't want to get lost in there. But there's a difference in terms of how we use these texts. And part of what I was thinking about was the way we keep coming into in this conversation values. The historical argument is basically that there are these things out there called ideas. And history is about sort of watching the progression of these ideas and how these ideas influence people. Fair, but what if we sort of reversed that and noted that it's actually these ideas in the context of people and community with all of their ideas about status and morality. And one of the things that, again, is almost always forgotten. Well, first of all, I've often found that people who aren't intimately familiar with communities that live with texts, and again, many different communities live with texts, but by virtue of the tradition of living with the text and the particularities of that text, there'll be a ton of nuance in there. And what you're looking for as things go is the way that, well, how do these texts sort of go back and forth and inhabit these? And so often I find people who are unfamiliar with how communities fight over these texts, and I would assume Islam, certainly Judaism, definitely Christianity, the tradition that I have my experience with, we fight about these texts constantly. And so the fighting over these texts has everything to do. Now, I've lived through two major wars in the Christian Reformed Church that have shaped my denomination. One of them was over women in church office, and the other was over same-sex marriage. And these have been wars over the text. You can read Mark Knoll on how the American Civil War shaped the reading of those texts, and that comes up quite a bit here in terms of slavery. So I often find that the atheists and the agnostics sort of have kind of a simplistic reading that, well, these texts say, do this, don't do this. Yeah, but let's pull something else from the atheist playbook and say, yeah, there's a lot of contradictions between do this and don't do this. And they touched a little bit on Paul and what women should and shouldn't do in the church. That my denomination fought over those texts for 25 years. And in some cases, we've been fighting about those texts even longer. So it's these texts never sort of function in that way. They're always functioning within the worlds. And again, another point that I thought of quite a bit during this video, but is almost never articulated, is usually Christians look at these texts as, well, I'm going to please God or make God angry. I'm going to fulfill the law or I'm going to violate the law. I can't get this camera quite. There we go. I'm going to fulfill the law or I'm going to violate the law. Yeah, fair enough. But these texts also work in ways of sort of karmic navigation. Fulfill the law and you will be blessed. Violate the law and you will be cursed. I think I've got that Jess video. So Jess took this from the conversation I had with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot from Midwestuary this little conversation the three of us had, and I still have qualms about how hard I pressed. And I thought this was going to be one segment of it, but it really went over, and then Jess sort of took this into a sort of a YouTube shorts and added so let's just play it.
Jess asked you such an interesting question about Job. He told me, was Job wise? But that's such a subtle question, because the whole premise behind the book of Job is that, well, how do you know that you're in the favor of the gods? You have many sons and daughters, and your flocks flourish, and I do the sacrifice. I'm good to the men at the gate. And then, of course, it all collapsed. The raiders comes in, the house, the whirlwind takes down the house, and the friends say, Job, you have no wisdom. How do we know? It all collapsed.
I have a different interpretation of the book of Job. I think the book of Job is there because of an axial confrontation with a Bronze Age idea, the just world hypothesis, that the world is intrinsically just,
right,
and runs as just machinery.
Right.
And it doesn't.
Right.
Right? Because Auschwitz, this is the question we have been asking since the axial revolution. How do we know when somebody knows? And I'm not trying to do epistemology here, okay?
Right.
But what we've said is, well, what we do is we come up with ecologies of practices for reducing self-deception, and that's what the scientific methods, there isn't a single scientific method. The scientific methods are this, and we've figured out certain kinds of argumentation, certain dialogical relations, reduce the chance of self-deception, increase the chance that none of these are foolproof, they're all error-prone, but we can constantly work to make them more self-improving.
How will we measure the good on the other side of this shift? Just like...
Okay, right there. How will we measure the good? And part of what religious communities do is they're always struggling with this. And they're struggling with this on two levels. On one level, they're struggling with this in terms of, well, what does the text say? Because they want to be obedient, because they believe this is divine revelation in one way or another. And that then impinges on, how do I please God because I want to make God happy? I can do misery, deliverance, gratitude. How can I express my gratitude to God? How can the great Andre Crouch song? How can I say thanks for the things he has done for me? So that's at one level. Another level is pleasing God means winning God's favor, if you want to look at it in that way. And winning God's favor means I'll be blessed. And so doing this means blessing. And this is, again, I think John nicely said it, this is the actual age thing. But then there's this question of faith, because sometimes, and this is where Job and Jesus come into the mix, because sometimes being faithful means you lose. And then suddenly we get these two worlds mythologies that, I've talked a lot with John Vervaeke in the past. We lose in this age, but we receive our inheritance in the next. And you can see that right in Jesus' story, where, well, he, in a sense, runs through it quickly, and we will run after him. But he is sacrificed, he's raised and vindicated, and then he's ascended into heaven, which is also part of the vindication, because now he reigns on high. Okay. So texts work in this. And so when the Hebrews receive the law at Sinai and they receive the Torah, they are doing this. Just read the end of the book of Deuteronomy. If you fulfill this, if you fulfill the covenant, you'll be blessed. Your enemies will run from you. Your crops will flourish. Your animals will multiply. You'll have many sons and daughters, and they'll flourish, and they'll live long, and you'll live long. Just read the end of Deuteronomy. If you break the covenant, well, then your enemies will be on top of you, and your children will be sick, and your crops will fail, and the rains won't come, and your animals won't breed, and they'll struggle. And so, and one of the ways to read through that Old Testament is about covenant faithfulness. But that, again, as John notes, that is challenged in this transition to the axial age, where Job struggles. Now, in the end, Job is vindicated, but can you really have replacement children? Now, again, a part of what we're dealing with here is when we hear that, we think, of course not. But if you do any work with genealogies, you don't have to go back that far. And this couple has a child, they call him John, and then the child dies. Then they have another little boy, and they call him John. And it's like, why are you recycling the names? It's not George Foreman. That's a replacement child. And she's like, no, you can't replace a child. They're all what? Individuals. And that transformation, the invention of the individual, and it was Seidelkopf's, his book was mentioned in this. That's huge. But this is how texts are read and texts are lived with. And the whole community knows the text and they struggle with the text.
Job's friends were measuring it before the shift, and Job is enacting the shift. And if we're in the middle of the shift, if we are in fact in that shift, what will the good look like
After the shift?
Now, this is what I was talking with John Vervaeke was, we're talking about AI. And on one hand, John Vervaeke, I began that by challenging him and saying, you're kind of a fundamentalist. What do you mean I'm a fundamentalist? I mean, he's saying no AI, no LLMs, but just for research, because at some point the AI may achieve enlightenment and we might have AI sages and AI gods, as it were. And I was like, I don't think we'd recognize them if we see them. Why? Because we're before the shift, and what you're imagining is probably a shift, not unlike the shift that John was pointing to.
Yes.
This is like, sorry, I'm hesitating because the dauntingness of the philosophical question you're posing, like you're asking, like, what's our sort of ultimate standards by which we evaluate if something is good or bad? The theology of the Axial Age is fundamentally different from the theology of the Bronze Age.
Yes.
You look at the Egyptian theology and you look at Platonic theology.
And you're arguing that the new theologies are also going to pass through
That's right.
a similar transformation.
That's right. And you can't know, I can't tell you how it's going to be better until we're there. It's like I can't tell you what it's going to be like to be a parent until I've had a child.
Because even the definition of better will change.
Yes.
Yes.
I think we're in agreement then.
Yes.
And I'm worried that we're leaving you out.
It was funny. I still feel bad. So in some ways, Alex O'Connor and many others, these conversations are impossible to have. And at one point, Glen Scrivener basically says, it's not like we're doing it's not like we're doing science or math as if we know what we're doing with science and math. Because increasingly, it's occurring to us that we don't know what we're doing with science and math, because when you make a car, we thought we knew what a car was. We thought we knew what a washing machine was. We thought we knew what contraceptives were. We thought we knew what computers were. And maybe we don't have any clue what these things are. Even though we think, well, I made a machine to wash clothes and the clothing is washed. Yeah, but we didn't imagine what that would do to the relationship between men and women. And we didn't imagine that maybe the washing machine is as deadly as atomic weapons, but they just take 500 years to kill us all. Well, how would washing machines kill us all? Well, if we stop having babies, the us all that we imagine is this idea of humanity.
The things that these people do, which, it sort of carries some of the justification for invading. Now, of course, in his heart of hearts, Julius Caesar probably just wanted Gaul for himself, but he at least appealed to this notion. Now, I could easily say, look, there is this, popular Judeo-Christian tradition, which has this which is totally okay with human sacrifice. the famous story of Abraham and Isaac. Of course, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac in the end, but it's the willingness to commit, and indeed the sacrifice of his own child, in reverence to this sort of strange ancient philosophical belief that they had, which we would never recognize today, that you should sacrifice your own children on behalf of your philosophical convictions. Also in Exodus chapter 22, verse 29, there's this very...
People sacrifice their own children on behalf of their own philosophical convictions all the time. They don't use fire and wood and knives, but they do sacrifice their children.
strange injunction to sacrifice your children to God, which is like immediately renegotiated, where God says, you know, as with the lamb, please pull it up. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means. Some people think that this actually would be an instance of you will...
All right, so there's a lot of weeds that these guys get into, and I don't know that the conversation in the end went that well, but there are things to harvest from this. Okay, they get into this falsifiability thing.
Looking for falsifiability when we're not talking about science, okay? So falsifiability works brilliantly if you've got population A, population B, and a control group, and let's run the experiment, and let's look at the results, and we'll ABC test it, okay? You cannot do that with the past. You literally, we look back at the past.
Now, but we do sort of do this, because the truth is there have been many different Christian populations, and a lot of what, you know, I use the Holland thesis. I use versions of it like Glenn does. I do all that. I like the thesis. I think it's powerful. I think it works well. I think it speaks, but it isn't infallible, because one of the things that you begin to notice is that there are lots of different Christian communities, and not all of them yield the kinds of things that we see in Western Christendom. And in fact, in some ways, that tree gets narrower. You can look at Orthodox communities. A lot of the values that we have in the West did not emerge in Orthodox communities in the same way. Part of which was because a lot of those Orthodox communities were destroyed by Islam. A lot of those Orthodox communities were sort of consumed by communism and have just now sort of emerged from that. But of course, communism would have had an impact on them too. You know, you might say, well, that doesn't mean that they were corrupted by communism. No, but they were changed by resisting the communists in a similar way that the Roman Catholic Church didn't necessarily succumb to Protestantism, but was changed by engaging with Protestantism. So, and then you can run A, B, C, and D, and you look at, well, an example that I've brought up quite a bit, which is 19th and 20th century Italian history, where these values of the West that Tom and Glenn are promoting, not the values of the papacy. Now, there's some roots in there that are together, and they're closer than, let's say, Orthodoxy or certain other Christian traditions that are out there, Nestorian, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then you look at the French, and the French are different too. In fact, a lot of this has to do with the Anglosphere Christian history, and a lot of it has to do with Protestant Christian history. And in fact, a lot of those, which lends more into, let's say, but this was the Enlightenment, but then you have the difficulty that to what degree does the Enlightenment happen within Latin Christendom? To what degree does the scientific revolution happen within Latin Christendom? So already with Latin Christendom, you've just got a lot of accumulation of these things. And again, Glenn is right. You don't have it. The problem is you don't have a control group. You just have history, which, as C.S. Lewis notes, is just one string of one-offs after another.
There is not A, B, or C past. There is only A. And that A has been 20 centuries of some very profound Christianization. And we've come out the other end of 20 centuries of very, very strong Christianization. And the extraordinary thing is that so many people are able to think of Tom Holland's thesis as wild or,
it's an incredibly modest thesis, which I think is quite obvious. And it's quite obvious to everyone else around the world. When everyone else comes to the UK, they're just like, well, I've come to a Christian country, haven't I?
You think that?
Right.
You think people come to the UK and think, wow, how profoundly Christian this place is?
Yeah.
You think you walk around
Have you talked to immigrants? They come. I've come to this country. It seems to be a Christian country. Now, devout Muslims might look into the West and think, this is what Christianity is. It has become so decadent. It is so, it is so, self-obsessed, etc., etc.
Now, I've got the tape. This guy, born in the United States, born just outside of New York City, spent almost all of his life in the United States, was asked almost this same question on a Dutch podcast.
Was Greek and Hebrew for biblical studies quite easily.
Your grandfather wasn't?
My grandfather and my father were both Dutch Calvinist pastors.
Dutch Calvinist pastors
Christian
in the United States?
In the United States.
Okay.
The Christian Reformed Church in the United States has been very self-consciously Dutch most of its time. And over the last number of decades, trying to figure out what to do with our cultural heritage with respect to our American culture. Been a dominant conversation in the Christian Reformed Church in the United States.
That's astonishing. So your grandfather read Abraham Kuyper?
The last books my grandmother would allow my grandfather to have in their tiny little retirement place was Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck in Dutch. He died with those books next to his bed.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very serious in the Christian Reformed Church in the United States, though.
Mm.
Yeah,
has something to do with cultivating, standing in a tradition.
Yes. The Christian Reformed Church, in many ways, in the 1970s, one of the preeminent pastors put an article in the banner, the Christian Reformed publication, about it's time to burn the wooden shoes. That's as late as the 1970s. And the specific church I grew up in was mostly a Dutch Calvinist church in an African American congregation. And so my upbringing was very much Christian day school and African American in the context of the civil rights movement. And so that was really the environment in which I grew up in, trying to figure out what do we get from Kuyper, Bavinck, our Dutch heritage that we can bring as something distinctively valuable to this American context.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, to the African American context.
Yeah, very interesting. So you mentioned the wooden shoes, the klompen.
Yeah.
And it's one of my irritations also about Dutch culture, that people think that folklore is the same as culture. But it is, of course, very much more, especially, I would say, language.
Yes.
But to close off that topic and to get to the next one, maybe you can tell me a little bit about your impressions now that you've been traveling through the Netherlands, about the differences in religious experiences in this day and age between people in the United States and here. Maybe in general, so maybe some sketches about the different experiences of spirituality, religion, and more specific. So how people go to church, especially in the Reformed Church. Would interest me to hear a little bit about that. Is it the same?
Well, so I grew up amongst, there were the way, my parents came in the 1890s, my great-grandparents, but there was also a wave of immigrants after the Second World War into the Christian Reformed Church. And so I grew up listening to immigrants from the Netherlands from the 1950s lament the changes in the Netherlands, what happened to churches and spirituality. And so that was sort of the background. And then when I got here, I was quite surprised where the religion, Christianity, and even Christianity here is built into the buildings and the walls and the pavement of the country, even though secularism is also quite evident. It's a remarkable juxtaposition that I see here. Because I grew up partially in a Dutch Calvinist immigrant, but partially in an African American, all within an American context, I've always been rather sensitive to culture, and I find I find a thesis of the implicit Christianity within secularization compelling when I get here, because on one hand, it's quite evident that this is a this is a multicultural context here, especially in the urban Netherlands. Yet we've been doing a lot of driving in the countryside. And what I see here is these spires of historical churches dominating the landscape, with the exception perhaps of these giant electrifying windmills. But so I've been fascinated by the dance of religion, implicit religion, that I see going on in your culture here.
Yeah. Cities still, in a way, organized around the church. Huh?
Yes.
Around churches, so
Yes.
being the spiritual center, but at the same time empty.
Yes.
Often holding a fitness center or I don't know, some place where you can maybe look at the art the neighbor made. And sometimes, of course, more established churches, they found a new spiritual purpose, but
yes.
Yeah, well, most are empty.
Yes.
What I wanted to say.
Exactly.
So so and in my I perceive the United States as a pretty religious country, huh? And that's also what the stats say. But is this something that you would also say, that the United States are more deeply still Christian, whereas the Dutch are maybe we have culturalized Christianity. It's in our buildings, it's in our institutions. That's true, but at the same time, it's gone. Very little left.
It's perhaps in the people in North America, because otherwise the stones would have to cry out, which is what you have here in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Because when I walk through this, I've never been to Leiden. When I walk through this town, in a sense, the stones are speaking to me of this long, rich tradition, which in some ways is built so deeply into the culture that it's no longer seen. And so then you have the question, how loudly can the stones still speak? And can we hear what the stones have to say? Whereas in North America, one of the things that many have noticed in terms of immigration to North America, even religious traditions that weren't fundamentally congregational, when they got to North America, congregationalized, because I think spirituality in people has to be instantiated at some level. And so perhaps in this level, because there's so much instantiation in the buildings, in the culture, and that which doesn't appear to us to be explicitly religious, the buildings carry the weight, whereas in a new world like North America, people have to carry the weight and the congregations have to carry the weight. So it's just
Another video I'll play.
Sorry, I'm not understanding what you're trying to communicate to me right now.
I'm trying to communicate in the context of Western Europe, you're getting the world that you want. And it will,
Sure.
It is, yeah, I'm positive of that. All of the data indicate that the world that you're advocating is coming. And we'll see the consequences of that.
I mean, I think all of the world has lots of problems, but I would say the biggest one is racism and anti-immigrant racism, authoritarianism. I think those are the big problems. And I ultimately think when you're comparing things like violence against Christians and violence against Muslims, you have to go back like 10, 20 years. A Christian country killed 1 million Muslims in an invasion in the Middle East. And that is the context in which this immigration is taking place.
Which country is this?
What's that?
Which country is this?
This was the United States.
The United States
during
is a
the
Christian country?
So George W. Bush, during the invasion, very
he may have engaged
directly
in terminology, but
very directly said, cited
Crusade.
God. Yes, if you look at the statistics,
crusade, yeah.
If you look at the statistics of
he
Congress,
wasn't doing it for Christian reasons.
Almost all of, almost every person in power in this country is Christian.
I'm an atheist, so I don't know what, but I'm just glad that you were honest with me and said there's no.
Brian Burge, Ross Douthat, that whole conversation they had. What do we mean when we use that word Christian? Do we mean someone who identifies as a Christian? Do we mean someone who lives in a way that is distinctively Christian? Well, what is distinctively Christian? Because part of it is, well, you can look at the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 critiques like these three main forms of observance: almsgiving, prayer, fasting. Is right now we started last. So is fasting Christian? Is fasting Muslim? Is fasting Buddhist? Now we have the secular painted bricks question that I had in another video. But what was amazing, this is this cameraman who pops off because he gets upset listening to Peter Boghossian talk to, who's this other guy? He writes books about Islam. He's like, and very quickly, America, on one hand, well, America is a Christian country. Christians are responsible for attacking the Muslims. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You're at the same time arguing that America is a secular country and there ought not to be any religious Christian influence, but people can do any you just watch this word just swirl around, and where are we here?
Etc. But their idea, because they don't have a separation of church and state, because they don't have the secular. I mean, this is impossible to prove. I mean, I don't know. I suppose it depends on who you ask. But anybody listening, if they visited the UK, like walked around London and thought, wow, how profoundly Christian everything is here. I'd like to speak
from another religious.
Well, they're meeting in Oxford. Have you ever been to Oxford? The place is practically a church. It's one church after another. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. But, they're in Oxford. And this, of course, triggers a whole Christianity and civilization conversation.
Point of view. From another religious point of view, a Chinese person comes to the UK. They are thinking that it's Christian, right? Right? A Muslim person comes to the UK. They say, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who we've both spoken to, when she went to the Netherlands, she just thought it was a Christian country, right?
I guess we should avoid this. This is essentially like it's almost anecdotal, but the people who give the anecdotes aren't even here. So this is kind of an impossible thread to follow.
But my point is that the falsifiability thing is illegitimate because counterfactuals in history are just notoriously.
The reason I'm asking is because, for example, if I were to say, and this is an oversimplification, but if I were to say something like, I think that Western civilization is profoundly vegan, you would say, I don't think that's true because, the West might...
Because let's look at the history.
Because the West just like, serves hot dogs like all over the place. And it'd be like, okay, actually, fair enough. That shows that maybe society isn't vegan. Now, if we lived in a vegan world where everyone was vegan, and I could say, the West is profoundly vegan, you might ask me, yeah, but, you could say that about anything. What would be an example of...
But I actually like that illustration because you say, name a vegan country. You might think a little bit. You say, well, India, maybe. You might say, yeah, is India a vegan country? Yeah. Do they eat meat in India? Yeah. Well, why would you say India is a vegan country? Because you're probably comparing it to, let's say, Argentina, where there's great meat in Argentina. Brazil, great meat in Brazil. Is Iran a teetotaling country? Can you get alcohol in Iran? See, these words are slippery, but they do have some purchase. And so that's why, as Glenn was making, this isn't sort of clean room science, but we do sort of understand tendencies and how things work. And part of what you have in the United States is Christianity moved offshored all of its stuff to different institutions. So the universities, what video am I thinking of here? Here it is.
Right. I think that's definitely a reason. I think another reason where Catholics and Orthodox have an advantage over Protestants today is that they still have their historic strong institutions. Because if you have a strong institution, there's so many resources at your disposal. You can have apologetics to defend your faith. You can have scholars to answer the hard questions of the faith for you. You can have, campus ministries everywhere. There's endless advantages to have strong institutions. Catholics and Orthodox have not been alienated from their own institutions. An Orthodox church built 500 years ago, it's still Eastern Orthodox, still preaching Eastern Orthodoxy. The Catholic Church built 500 years ago, still Catholic, still preaching Catholicism. A
Wow.
Protestant church built 500 years ago, it's
No way.
preaching the United Nations and the environment and nothing else, right? And it's basically just turned into a museum. So Protestants used to have strong institutions. Remember, the Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, founded by Bible-believing Protestants. Brown, founded by Baptists. Baptists founded an Ivy League school. Most Protestants do not know that. The vast majority of young Christians I've talked to did not know that the Ivy League schools were founded by Bible-believing conservative Protestants. They didn't know that. Because the public schools, like the ones I went to, teach that Christians have just been the bad guys in history. So that's why I think
what happens is Christianity was in some ways so successful, certain kinds of Christianity that got simply absorbed. And that's part of Glen's thesis, that these religions basically got absorbed into it, and they got absorbed into the institutions. One thing Christianity has done quite well is it starts with things that it just hands it off. And that's what secularism is often, all right, so you might question the Trinity, you might not believe in the virgin birth, but hospitals are a good thing. So we're going to sort of paint over the brick and call it secular. We're going to paint it with the secular color and say, here, you can run this. Go ahead and help run the hospital. And a big part of Tom Holland's thesis is the deracination, the fact that the roots are gone, but everything around us is there. Now, it comes from there. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that in Europe, the stones cry out, but in America, it's all built new and everything's sort of forgotten. And people don't know. Americans are they're just not historically aware. We tear things down and we build new things. So it's just all sort of absorbed. And in fact, as Glen Scrivener will make the point in the video, secularity itself is this legacy from Christianity that comes from Latin Christendom. And again, this is sort of the narrowing thesis that actually the thesis you get narrow Christendom and the invention of secularity, and then you get this separation of church and state, and back and forth, church and state, both as Christian institutions, sort of go back and forth, and they're all sort of doing all of this opponent processing between each other, trying to figure out what is Christian, what is flourishing, what is the good, back again to the Vervaeke conversation. All right, they spent a lot of time talking about slavery, which shouldn't be unexpected if you've watched all of these videos. Oh, there was one other thing that I wanted to get to before. Now, Alex O'Connor makes a strong point here, and he's right, that the Exodus isn't strictly anti-slavery. It's anti-slavery of the children of Israel, because they will go to the promised land and they will own slaves. So it's not really sort of an abolitionist. They're not getting rid of slavery completely. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But if you watch the video, there are certain moments where he tells a little story to illustrate his example of, well, you just don't people just open the Bible, read it, and do what it says? That basically shows us sort of the way that people who are not familiar with intergenerational fighting over interpretation, which can lead some people to agnosticism, but the way that is how communities live with texts and go back and forth, all within very much at the same time a seeking God's blessing and direction for it.
Kinds of reasons why this could have only happened in the West. It might have had something. I mean,
slave revolts. He makes the argument that basically, people get out of slavery because they don't like being slaves, and that's why you have slave revolts. And slave revolts are not unique to the Bible or Christianity. Slave revolts are all over the world. Everybody feared them because, yeah. But again, just acting so that I'm not a slave does not mean abolition.
think that a lot of the development of people's individual rights, their ability to begin asserting them, had a lot to do with technology. You know, like feminism in particular.
And I think that's true. You cannot divorce this from wealth, technology, but then the question is, how over time do these religious ideas and things in the books really impact people?
It might have had some. I mean, I think that a lot of the development of people's individual rights, their ability to begin asserting them, had a lot to do with technology. You know, like feminism in
And I agree.
particular. Really importantly, some of the roles that society could not do without.
The washing machine
Exactly.
transformed
Does
feminism.
so much, right? And so it's easy to say that it's because, you know, they were going to church. I mean, if that were the case, why didn't they do it 500 years ago? Why then? That happened to coincide with technological developments which allowed them to get out on the street and protest, right? Now, that might be that we might then need to talk about the scientific revolution as to why washing machines were invented in the first place, and we're going to disagree on that. But I really want to just drill down here and think I think that people who are living in oppressive conditions will have a motivation to, when they have an opportunity, try to overcome that, regardless of whether or not they're Christians. The only time in history...
Okay, let's talk about motivation. A slave revolt is not abolition. A slave revolt just basically says, I don't want to be a slave anymore. David doesn't kill Saul. Now, you might look in the Bible for, you shall not kill the king. Well, God tells, people to kill kings. That happens. Look at Elijah. Jehu's going to kill Ahab. It's going to end Ahab's line. Why doesn't David kill the king? Part of this gets to, again, there's always sort of a simplistic way that I think people who are not used to living within religious communities, they don't understand how the Bible works within those communities. And again, it's going to be different with Christians, because I think the Bible works differently in a Christian community than it does in a Jewish community or a Muslim community. I suspect. I don't know, because I haven't lived in the other two communities. This is part of the, non-falsifiable problem. But so much of what the Bible teaches is taught in narrative, where it isn't a rule that thou shalt not kill the kings, thou shalt not lay your hands on the Lord's anointed. And David, who is held up in high esteem, again, we're always looking at status. And in terms of how our moral sentiments are shaped, they are shaped communally. And Alex sees this, because later he's asked, what if you had to pinch hit for William Wilberforce? And I think his answer is great. I don't know how I would be. But that gets into your emotive morality, where these emotions and these moralities are created communally, and the book is read communally. And so it's not the case that it's seldom the case that someone reads something in the Bible, says, oh, bolt from a blue. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's right there. It's Jesus saying it. And you don't find a lot of Christians walking around with one eye because, gosh, if my one eye caused me to sin, the other one's going to do too. And so I'm walking around blind. You don't find that, even though it's right there in the text. Now, you could say in a simplistic way, well, Christians don't do what the Bible says. True. But Christians also read those passages within a tradition and within a community that says, we understand what hyperbole is. And so much of the Bible is lived in terms of a narrative community that sort of works like epigenetics, that sort of turns on and turns off different passages. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, kind of attack Protestants sometimes, because Protestants sort of emphasize the Bible a little bit more. But again, I think this is usually overplayed, because both, let's say, Protestants and non-Protestants actually do a lot in terms of a tradition and a community, and it has more to do with, well, what's sort of the final say, but we always read that Bible within our context.
That there's been a successful slave revolt on the level of a society, whereby, slavery has been overthrown and a new government and colonialism thrown off and slavery abolished of their own accord because of their own revolt, is the Haitian Revolution in Haiti, right?
Yeah.
I do not think.
But you have to understand that Haiti was different. It was different from the Dominican Republic. Haiti had its own particularities, and every single situation will have its own particularities. Haiti also, at that point, looked to America and thought, yeah, America threw off the tyranny of the British. Why don't the Americans welcome us? And they didn't. But the Haitians were still steeped in sort of a colonial European imagination. And even, you'd have to argue, Catholicism. Because the truth is about voodoo is you're not a good practitioner of voodoo if you're not a good Catholic. Now, some Catholics will say anyone who practices voodoo is not a good Catholic, but it sort of comes from the other way around. So
that Haitians were living in slavery under colonial rule, and they were kind of okay with it. And then they started thinking about Christianity and read the Bible and decided, you know what, now it's time to rise up. I think that there was enough in the
See, now again, obviously, I don't want to be a slave anymore. Let's not have slavery. But Haiti looked to the United States as sort of a model about how to throw off a European hegemon. They didn't do it in a vacuum. And if you want to run this experiment, you can compare. So again, those of you who don't know, I spent the first 6 years of my ministry in the Dominican Republic on the Haitian border, working with Haitians. But it was Catholic, and it was French, and all of those little things mean something. Americans are, for the most part, being held by Protestants, and that sets up a particular tension in America, in the American conversation about slavery and abolition. And again, read Mark Knoll's excellent book about that divide between the churches. And then that continues on. But in each case, the Bible itself is situated. It's not that the Bible is imagined to be, even though Christians talk this way sometimes, I do not blame agnostics and atheists for not understanding how the Bible functions within Christian communities. It's easy to look at Christians and say, all of you have two eyes. Nobody's been cutting off their hands, but you know your eyes are doing a lot of sinning. You know your hands are doing a lot of sinning. Why do you keep them on? You clearly don't believe Jesus. Well, we don't take those texts so simplistically. Yet, those texts do matter. And when it comes to, and those texts matter in different places within the Christian churches. So, I say in many ways that, in a lot of ways, I think Alex O'Connor won the debate, if you want to frame it that way. But he had a much easier point to make. He just had to say, isn't necessarily so. You're overstating the facts. There are multiple factors involved than just these one or two. And I think that's right. You can then take a step back and ask, why do Christians want to make this so bad? And why do others want to defeat it so bad, if we're going to get into motivation? And Christians have something to gain and others have something to lose. Early on in the conversation, Justin Brierley asks, why do you think this thesis, which has been around a long time, has really gained traction? And actually, they're pretty much on the same page there.
I think we've heard it, I'm sure it'll come through as well as we talk, Ben, that, as you elaborate the way that this has flowed out, as you see it, these modern values of kindness, equality, freedom, consent that we're going to be focusing on from those Christian origins and the way they've permeated the whole of our culture. Just one question before we leap into some specifics. It has become a very popular thesis, interestingly. It's not that Tom Holland was not the first person to point this out, but suddenly everyone seems to be talking about the Tom Holland thesis. And you have people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you've both interviewed at different points, I think almost at an intellectual level, convinced about the value of Christianity because of suddenly starting to see that we can't sustain a culture like ours without the Christian story at the bottom of it. And I'd just be interested in just at the beginning, before we get to the specifics, your sense of where that's come from, why perhaps someone who was at one time the most famous female atheist in the world has had this kind of about turn that seems to be so linked to the need for Christianity as a foundational story for our culture and that kind of thing? Maybe start with you, Glenn, and then come to Alex.
I think in one sense, the Tom Holland thesis is unremarkable and quite modest in that Christianization is 20 centuries of Christianization has had a profound impact on our moral sensibilities, and it's even had an impact on the way we see other sources of moral intuition in the West. I think that's actually quite a modest position to take on things, and quite widespread. Whether you're against Christianity and you're Nietzsche and you think, yes, Christianity has done a number on us all and it's a bad thing, or whether you are agnostic about these sorts of things like a Tom Holland is, or a Larry Seidentop, or a...
I suppose I'm asking, why is it resonating so much then? It's not new necessarily, and it's fairly modest in its claim, but it seems like everyone's picking it up suddenly, and I wonder, well, what's changed for it to become so resonant?
I think he wrote it in 2019, and I think if he'd written it 20 years earlier, that's when kind of the end of history was kind of being proclaimed as this, okay, we win, modern liberal Western democracies are the future, everybody will get on board, and it's plain sailing from here on in. And I think that there was the kind of the conceit that there's a post-war consensus, prosperity is on the up, stability is on the up, peace is reigning, and you could almost believe that everything's getting better in a kind of a Steven Pinker sort of sense, and I think in the last 20 years from there till 2019. We've gone through some incredible upheavals and a lot of people questioning just how obvious liberal Western democracy, democratic ideals are. I mean, one reason for that might be 9/11 and then the 9/11 wars, in which, okay, let's just remove the Taliban and Afghanistan will become an egalitarian utopia, or we'll just remove Saddam Hussein and modern Western liberal democracy will just reign. And
you have to remember that 9/11 is also the rise of the new atheist, and their main thesis is it's just reason. It's universally accessible to everyone. Reason is just what the clear human mind works on. And if you can shovel off all this religious baggage on top and leave sort of base material reality and listen to Sam Harris. Well, reason is just the good and the bad. You can sense it, you can feel it, chase the good. And so, in that sense, the new atheists are sort of the moral neocons. They kind of come in and well, obviously, if we get rid of Saddam and the Ayatollahs and all of these religious fanatics, then, didn't we have that at the end of the First World War? We've got Ataturk, we've got Egypt, but, Islam almost evaporated. And, so let's just shovel it away again and we'll have these great democracies come up.
I think we've had to wrestle in lots of different ways with those geopolitical issues. I think de-Christianization has happened in America in a quite profound way. 40 million Americans left church this century. And there's kind of a sense of, with institutional Christianity and believing Christianity in some senses in the West in the rearview mirror, I think there's been much more of a sense of people missing what they once had, and the Dominion thesis sort of naming that. I think at low tide, you sort of see what the sea had done in a sense that at high tide, you have no idea about the shaping influence of the sea. Low tide actually might reveal that.
Low tide being a metaphor drawn from Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith that has gone out, and only then do we see
the melancholy long withdrawing roar.
How that Sea of Faith shaped our
and of course, tides come back in again. That's so it's been said. That's a fun sort of rejoinder, isn't it? But even if they don't, my point is, at low tide, there are things that you see what lies beneath, and I think people have seen sort of anti-woke backlash as well. There's a sort of progressivism that might be shorn of Christianity and become quite authoritarian, and people might be concerned about that. There's an anti-woke backlash that looks at that, and they call them the woke, and they actually want the power thing and the dominance thing. And so yeah, people have become they've seen that the story of the West has run out a little bit, and they're wondering, is there a grand narrative? And Tom Holland is giving them a historical narrative.
And you've got the problem that, Ross Douthat's, if you don't like the religious right, wait till you see the non-religious right. And, oh shoot, did I make that short? Both the left and the right in America are deeply penetrated by Christian code. Both sides, in different ways. But they share so much code that you get these strange elements where the left, which can tend to be more Nietzschean, more postmodern, will complain about the Nietzschean aspects of Trump. And the right that wants to use Trump, they basically say, we can't beat the left with Jesus qualities. We'll preserve them at home, but we'll go send our dog after them, who is Trump. And the left basically has the flip side that says, no, those Jesus values, they don't really work in our private life, but we demand that the government be Jesus for us. Boy, I'm getting a lot of mileage out of this article. Losing faith in atheism. And this is part of the point, that the thesis is attractive personally for people, because people are looking and saying, I want to somehow believe that, you could say, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but that sort of had a certain political valence. And so what I need to do is appropriate this for myself. And if I want to believe this myself, I need to live within a community that is reading that book, that is reinforcing this thing, because Alex O'Connor talks about your moral imagination being shaped by your emotion. Well, I would argue it's more shaped by your context and your community than that. And so if you want to have the feels of that emotion, you had better get into that church, and you'd better get into that community. And if you want to actually believe things that on one hand are more like Job and Jesus and transcend, let's say, immediate feedback of do good things happen, you're going to have to be in church. He writes quite a bit about romantic idealism here, which is interesting because when I listen to Alex O'Connor talk about sort of his moral imagination and the emotional aspect of it, I would like to hear him dive more deeply into that. So Alex, if you want to come on my channel, I'll make room. And I'll be a very gracious host. The signal predicament of our era is the rise of illiberalism and intolerance. Secular liberals who had observed these forces with quite justified horror have often linked them to familiar enemy, religion. In their view, Christian nationalism was one of the primary ideologies behind right-wing illiberalism. Meanwhile, they tend to see the strain of left-wing thought, which rejects universal liberal principles, as equally under the sway of a kind of faith, the cult or church of identity politics. Religion is a famously malleable sociological category, but if we stick to the criterion of theistic belief, the argument that modern-day illiberalism is primarily a religious movement does not really hold up. Perhaps the crudest way to make the point would be simply to note that the rise of illiberalism has gone hand in hand with the decline of theistic belief and religious practice, both in the United States and around the world. The avatar of American illiberalism, Donald Trump, is the first president. Well, why do they keep calling him a Nazi? Because people look in simplistic categories and they sort of see liberalism and they see authoritarianism, and they think liberalism means getting to do what you want. Authoritarianism means, order and control. And so Donald Trump is the first president in generations who does not even pretend to be influenced or motivated by Christian faith. Trump is best understood as our first Nietzschean president, a man who explicitly embraces the will to power as the ultimate value, a force to which even the truth must give way. Many of the young and highly educated cohorts who populate the portions of the left most suspicious of universal liberal values are among those least likely to identify as religious believers. In a different manner than Trump, they hold the so-called objective truths or expressions of power dynamics, tools used by elites to oppress the marginalized. In place of these truths, they champion the importance of the identity and authenticity. Part of the problem with postmodern slave revolts is you're just using power. And again, what people desperately want to inhabit is a universe where they imagine the arc of history bends towards justice, or there's a God who really cares, who lives away up there, and you can make contact with this God. And what you do in terms of the sacrifice you see acted out in Jesus actually will get you what Jesus says it will. Now, Jesus doesn't say it won't get you a cross in this world. He lives that. What he says it'll get you is resurrection and reigning over a new heaven and new earth. And if you're going to believe that, even though you've been deeply formed by a materialist imagination, you're probably going to have to deeply embed yourself within a community of people who believe that and live that and practice that. And they might be prioritizing certain elements of the Bible more than others, and they might be reading into that Old Testament and seeing those little glimmering nuggets and say, aha, that's the direction this is pointed to. And someone might look at it flatly and say, no, I'm just going to total up the number of verses in the Old Testament that is either karmic or judgmental. But we all warp our reading. Our reading is along certain lines. So if you want to believe, or at least you want your neighbors to believe, because here's the thing, you might say, I think that, in a very Nietzschean way, I think that all that, lifting up the victims and saying that God cares for the poor, which is, there's a lot of that in the Old Testament too. I think all of that is just BS, but I sure want my neighbor to live that way. I want my neighbor to be generous. I want my neighbor to be self-sacrificial. I want my neighbor to extend everybody else's well-being at my expense. I want to live in a society that does that. So you're going to incentivize your neighbors to go to church? What if there's no church to go to because everybody's thinking their neighbor is? So if you look at people like Ben Franklin, George Washington, famous deists, they gave money to churches. Very rational people. Why? Because if the churches flourished and all their neighbors embodied the kind of self-sacrifice of Jesus, which is the same kind of self-sacrifice they believe good mothers possess, well, that's the kind of society I want to live in. That's why people are looking for it again. People want to live in it again. And what's more, we live in a society that doesn't just say, I want my neighbors to act that way. We live in a society that says, if I act that way, I can be a good person. I can be a better than average person. I can be someone who is celebrated for giving their life for the nation. We all have these heroic visions and ideals. That's why this isn't going away, and why people look at it and suspect, even though I might have doubts, even though the tiger eats the goat, I want to believe this is built into the universe, and whether it's a mother's love or Jesus' crucifixion, these are icons for me, for this world, for the future, and even the future beyond the grave. There you go. Ended with a sermon. Leave a comment.